So I'm going to go ahead and jump on in. I know folks are still coming in. Please do continue to say hi, tell us where you're coming from. But we've got a lot of great content to cover today. And so I'm really excited to get the festivities started here. First of all, hi, everybody, and thank you for being here. It's incredible to see so many of you joining us today. I've said this last month when we had our first chapter, and I will say it again today, and I will say it every time we have one of these events. I am so grateful. We are so grateful that you've chosen to spend your next 60 minutes with us. I know there's no shortage of things that you could be doing right now. My name, if I haven't met you, is Steve App, and I'm the AVP of Marketing and Business Development here at Simpson Scarborough. And we are here today to share the second chapter of our 2023-2024 CMO study, covering job satisfaction data and the changing role of the CMO. Now, before we dig into today's agenda, a few quick housekeeping notes. Yes, we are recording today's event, and you will receive a copy of that recording later today. And during our time together, please do continue to use the chat to share your thoughts, reactions to today's topic. If you have a question that you want answered by our team, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. Now, additionally, we have created a new hub for this year's study, which you can visit on our website. On the site, you can read overviews of each chapter, including today's chapter, which is officially live, and our first chapter on budgets and staffing data. You can download full reports, sign up for upcoming webinars, or catch recordings of events that you may have missed if you missed our first chapter or are watching a recording right here. As for today, I am joined by the one, the only Jason Simon, Simpson Scarborough's CEO, partner, and incredible recreational tennis player. Our Vice President of Research and Analytics and partner at Simpson Scarborough, Meredith Simpson, is also active in the chat today for any methodology questions that you might have as we run through our findings for this chapter. Now, last month, you heard us talk quite a bit about campus size. And this month, we're primarily evaluating our CMO study data through a job satisfaction lens. So let's talk about what it means to be satisfied in your role or dissatisfied in your role. We asked survey respondents to rate their level of job satisfaction on a 5-point scale. And then we classified CMOs as satisfied in their role if they rated their job satisfaction as good or excellent, and classified CMOs as dissatisfied in their role if they rated their satisfaction as poor, fair, or neutral. Beyond the classification, it's also important to understand why we're talking about job satisfaction in the first place. So back in the spring of 2022, some of you may remember this. This was right on the heels of our last CMO study. We at Simpson Scarborough actually made a pretty startling discovery. So within our higher ed, Marcom, professional development, and salary study, we actually found that more than half of senior marketing leaders said they were exploring new job opportunities. 1/3 of those individuals actually noted that they were open to leaving higher education altogether. And this discovery, among other things, surfaced a gap in our CMO study data collection. Because while we had been benchmarking nearly every aspect of the CMO role, we had neglected a core element, which was whether or not CMOs were even happy in those roles to begin with. And I think if you look at the demographics of this year's survey, the warning signs of turnover and leadership instability that we discovered in 2022 have, at least in part, come to fruition. More than half of the 268 respondents in this year's study are in their first CMO or CMO equivalent role. And even for those with prior C-suite experience, more than half have been in their current role for less than 3 years. And that instability exists above the CMO as well. Nearly 1/4 of CMOs have a new president in their role for less than 1 year. But the real question is, amidst all that instability, has job satisfaction improved since that original discovery in the spring of 2022? And the TLDR of today's presentation is, yeah, Nearly 3/4 of respondents in this year's survey reported being satisfied in their roles, and close to a third rated their job satisfaction is excellent, which is great. But this would honestly be a pretty boring event if that was the entirety of this story. So, as you can probably imagine, there's still quite a bit of value in unpacking this data through a job satisfaction lens. And partly because the very instability that we just showcased means that odds are most of you joining us today are not in your forever role. And when it comes to accepting your next offer, wherever and whenever that might be, you honestly need to think carefully about what feels like the right next step. Because as you're going to see over the next 30 minutes or so, job satisfaction can help us understand the ways that lead marketers in higher education need and want to evolve. Now, in order to do that, it's important to look at how far we've come. And make no mistake about it, CMOs have made some pretty incredible gains since our first study in 2014. Consider job titles, for example. So in 2014, only a quarter of lead marketers in higher education had a vice president title. This year, that percentage has nearly doubled to 45%. More specifically, only 8% of lead marketers had the explicit title of chief marketing officer. And this year, that percentage is 18%. And you may feel whatever way about job titles, but job titles do matter. They reflect a key component of formal power structures within a higher education's organizational structure. But they're not the only area of formal power structure. And in other areas, the decades-long growth that we've been seeing for CMOs is showing some signs of maybe evaporating a little bit. So, for example, in 2014, only 57% of lead marketers sat on their president or chancellor's cabinet. This year, that percentage has increased to 71%, which is great. However, that percentage is actually a step backwards from 2021, when 78% of lead marketers sat on cabinet. Similarly, just under half of lead marketers reported directly to their president in 2014. And this year, that percentage has increased to 63%. But, and you can probably guess where I'm going with this, this is actually a pretty significant drop from 2021, when nearly 3/4 of lead marketers reported directly to their president or chancellor. And our data does not tell the story of why this is happening, though it has been a topic of conversation within the agency over the past few weeks. And theories have abounded, from presidential instability to a potential pandemic bump to just overall budget reductions across colleges and universities all over our country. But I also think it's important to understand that this is not just a higher education trend. So just literally this week, Starbucks became the latest in an increasingly long line of private sector companies who are eliminating or evolving their CMO position. They joined UPS, Walgreens, Etsy, all of whom did the same in 2023, and McDonald's and Uber, among other companies who did so in prior years. And even going as far back as 2017, Harvard Business Review has noted that CMOs, more than any other cabinet level position, seem to have a disjointed relationship with CEOs. And I think for years, we've talked about the growth of the CMO in higher ed, while noting that that very growth lagged behind the corporate sector. And so I do wonder if it's fair to think that maybe higher education CMOs are now simply experiencing the next evolution, which once again is taking place maybe a year or a few years behind the corporate sector. But regardless of the reason for these shifts, this trend plays a big role in CMO job satisfaction. Satisfied CMOs were 35% more likely to say that they reported directly to their president or chancellor, and they were 40% more likely to say that they sat on cabinet than dissatisfied CMOs. So while the dynamic may be less common than it was 2 years ago, it remains a really critical component of any job offer that might come your way or that you're thinking about. Beyond formal power structures, it likely will not surprise you to know that money and resourcing matters quite a bit when we talk about job satisfaction. Satisfied CMOs, for example, were more than twice as likely to report an increase in their overall marketing budget this year compared to dissatisfied CMOs. And the other side of that coin, of course, which we talked a lot about last month in chapter 1, is staffing. And here too, a similar trend. Satisfied CMOs were 66% more likely to report an increase in the size of their team over the past year. And we really can't talk about resourcing and staffing without talking about an individual salary for the CMO. And while CMOs at every size institution have seen their salary increase over the last 10 years, though I think it's worth noting that in many cases, these gains have only barely exceeded the rise of inflation. Satisfied CMOs, on average, earn $35,000 more than their dissatisfied colleagues. And if you were with us last month when we talked about budgets and staffing, you may be thinking the same thing at this point that I am, or was when I was originally looking at this data. And that is that, once again, we're going to talk about campus size. And that is honestly a pretty logical conclusion, to be honest, because after all the foundational elements that we just went through, budgets, staff, salary, these are the very same attributes that were prime examples of the chasm that we talked about in our first chapter, a chasm largely defined by campus size. But what's interesting is that when we look at job satisfaction purely by campus size, there's no statistical difference in job satisfaction, depending on if you work at a small, medium, or large size campus. And honestly, that was our first clue to look a little deeper into the job satisfaction data. And when we did that, what we found is that more than any of the elements I just referenced, while important, it's a CMO's portfolio that impacts job satisfaction. It is their ability to influence more than the promotional P that impacts job satisfaction. It's their ability to make a difference across their campus that impacts job satisfaction. This isn't really about a chasm, not in higher ed, and I would say not in any industry. Rather, I think what we're talking about today is just an absolute splintering, where the role of the lead marketer, and I'm going to use that term deliberately in this case, is fracturing into several different definitions, titles, portfolios, and KPIs, all based on the individual needs of a given campus. Amidst all this chaos, one thing remains clear, and it was clear when we conducted our first CMO study in 2014, although we may have been less boisterous in saying it back then. Marketing cannot just be about promotion anymore. In fact, it really never was. So let's dig deeper into the CMO portfolio and continue to explore the ways in which CMOs need and want to evolve in the coming years. And for that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Jason Simon. Jason.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. It's great to see all of this dialogue and chat back and forth. You guys are doing such a great job of previewing this next section. So as Steve mentioned, we kind of are boiling some of these early findings down into some thoughts around how complex this role really is. And the first thing that we really want to talk about is the elephant in the room. And that is this idea that the CMO of the future is also the Chief Communications Officer. That's the reality every leader on this call knows all too well. Every day on a campus brings a new challenge or crisis, a new leadership issue to tackle, a reputational issue to avert. These are the things that require time and attention. There's strains for both the person that is sitting in the leadership role, but also then to the entire marketing communications team. And at the same time, the media landscape has become really, really fragmented. It's not just enough to develop a kind of compelling brand story or content strategy. we have to ensure that it's consistent across all of the various channels that we own or are investing in. We need our content and our stories to not just be newsworthy or newsworthy to those of us that are in the marketing and communications offices, but to point to a broader set of brand outcomes and to be measurable. We have these content machines that we have created through the staffing of marketing communications units that are just putting stories out into a void of real measurement and impact. So we have to be able to manage across both of these realities, the communications and issue side, and then the need to build reputation on the marketing side, and ensure that the things that we're doing aren't running counter to that kind of issues management side of things. Otherwise, it's just a recurring zero-sum effort. So to take it back a little bit to the data, you can see here some of those things that were overall responsibilities of the central marketing communications team. On the corporate side of things, and Steve was alluding to this a little bit, there generally are PR, corporate communications, internal communications specialists to go along with marketing. And there are even things like board and investor relations groups at large Fortune 500 companies. In higher ed, we see generalists generally, and we've found that despite some modest, consistent reductions in the CMO portfolio, the lead marketer and their teams generally remain responsible for a lot of complex responsibilities within the institution, regardless of kind of organizational structure. Most notably, we can see high responses in the avenues of communication. Crisis communication at 84%, social media at 89%, which is essentially content and storytelling, college and university news, 84%, media relations at 85%, and internal communications at almost 80%. Despite the fact that, many institutions have larger revenue and budgets than some of those corporate marketing communications roles that we were referencing, it's just not a reality in higher education that schools are going to have both a CCO and a CMO on the cabinet. I saw some chat about this. Even right now, and Steve alluded to this in the earlier data point, we're seeing some level of reduction of that being a cabinet level position or reporting directly to the president as there's pressure on the number of administrators. So, we're just not comfortable. We're just now really getting comfortable with having a single person on the cabinet. So having both of these roles represented is a real challenge. So, the reality is that the chief marketing officer or that equivalent of the senior role is going to have to spend a good amount of time on crisis management, on institutional PR kinds of things. And they have to be equipped to either handle those things and be that lead with their administration directly, or ensure that they have significant leadership on their team that can spend time focusing on that, so that they are able to then focus on the more traditional brand and marketing efforts. So, thinking about the future CMO, it's really a hub of kind of this integration that we were just talking about, the marketing and communications effort. We truly are living in an age of integrated marketing communications. It's a priority for nearly every leader that we speak with. It's where job satisfaction, and this is kind of where the job satisfaction piece really enters into the chat, because the vast majority of CMOs, as we just sort of showed a few slides ago, are responsible for communications, but they don't have the support within their team to handle that responsibility. And that plays such a big part of job satisfaction. You can see here some kind of notable discrepancies in job satisfaction, the satisfied versus the unsatisfied leader, and some of those key communications roles. Most CMOs, regardless of satisfaction level, have a communications director on staff. But we see some pretty significant gaps start to emerge once we look at things like issues management, media relations roles, copywriters or storytelling roles. And if you were joined us last time for the session that we did, Vanessa talked a little bit about the difference between insourcing and outsourcing of certain key functions. We tend to put a lot of our budgets into staffing. And what we're saying is that if this is a real blind spot for you or your institution, if you're dealing with the constant crisis, instead of being able to also work on some of the proactive marketing things, then this is an area that you've got to look at either some level of investment for a senior role on your team or having some form of ongoing agency support. And all too often, institutions are going to spend a boatload of money with PR and crisis firms in moments of crisis. But that partnership really should extend to, avoiding the crisis, working proactively to allowing greater focus for internal teams and building that capacity there. This is particularly true for small teams where, when crises do arise, it literally takes the entire team away from the rest of the work that has to happen while this work is ongoing. So what does this look like when it works well? Boise State's challenges that they are facing in the state of Idaho are a real microcosm of kind of what's happening for higher ed as an industry right now. Sort of the misperceptions from the general public, what the institution stands for, who it serves, issues of trust, issues of questioning value. They're caught kind of in the crosshairs of this country's kind of intensely polarized politics. And those misperceptions were really impacting their funding from the state legislature, as well as their reputation within the state. They wanted to do some proactive work to address this challenge, but they did it in a very, very integrated nature. So, what we helped them launch was a brand campaign that sort of set an inspirational, proud tone, highlighting kind of innovation, persistence, all in this notion of their blue turf. But what they complemented that brand effort with was a PR campaign that really told a related yet nuanced story. So the marketing campaign was focused around the brand pillars. The communications were really focused around the direct impact that Boise has on the state of Idaho. It shifted to the number of students that Boise serves from the state of Idaho, the programs they offer with in-demand occupations from within the state, the statewide economic impact. And you can see that even in some of these photos from a Boise State Day at the Capitol, sort of celebrating the significance of their impact on the state of Idaho. Many of these faces are the same as in the brand work. It's because they were really, really smart in identifying those stories of being native Idahoans, and really thought about this campaign in a truly integrated way that really helped tell that story of institutional impact, rather than just thinking about it from a brand standpoint or just from an advocacy or communication standpoint as well. I saw that Tricia Nolan from the University of Wisconsin-Madison is on this call. Thank you for joining us, Tricia. And I just want to harken back, if you saw Inside Higher Ed, I think it was yesterday or maybe the day before, there was a story about a similar effort right now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, kind of really focused. This kind of real focused effort and investment is critical. And you can call it whatever you want. You can call it branding, you can call it advocacy, you can call it communications. But the reality is it's an integrated marketing communications effort that really is coming with an intended outcome of really trying to lift positive sentiment and trust. This is the investment, the consistent investment, whether we're talking about at an industry level, at a system level, or at a campus level, has been missing from what we have historically done in this industry. And we have to make these investments consistently. So we applaud these efforts, whether it's, Tricia at Wisconsin, Boise State. We're doing similar work with Colorado and several other institutions across the country. These are the kinds of things that have to be invested in and thought about in this really true, smart, integrated communications way if we're going to be successful. So the second area that we want to focus on a little bit is brand experience. And what you say has to match not just your values, but the experience that people have. Maybe you've seen a few CMO titles recently that now include this notion of the Chief Experience Officer. We certainly are seeing that on the corporate side. I also know there's been a handful of those types of roles that have begun to emerge in higher education, and for good reason. Going back to the media fragmentation that I talked about just a few minutes ago, in addition to that, everything that's happening in terms of these like hyper-targeted algorithms around social that are serving up content, cookies disappearing, any of those kinds of things are leading to influencers and word of mouth being more important than ever. And so, the reality is a poor experience is going to be told in a much, much more visible way than any kind of brand effort that you might have. So every CMO needs to realize that no matter, whatever brand campaign that you're doing, it can't overcome a poor experience. One study from Salesforce in 2023 found that about 80% of customers now consider experience of a company to be as important as the products and services that it provides, right? In evaluating that brand. Now imagine that you're paying $50,000 a year for tuition, right? What's the service experience that you have to go along with that? It's not enough just to develop a story, to develop creative that feels distinct, to do things that are relevant and compelling. The example that we always use here is this one of like, how can you ask for a gift from an alum if they can't easily get a copy of their transcript, right? The experience does not match then the reality of what we are asking these customers to do. So there's a lot of expectations. It's one of the biggest purchases that somebody will make in their life. People literally wear their alma maters on their body. It shapes our identity and who we are. It's the reason that March Madness is worth billions of dollars. As humans, we feel less than fulfilled when our experiences don't match our expectations, right? That's just a reality of what psychology kind of looks like on the emotional cycle. What we're sharing with you here is the human experience cycle. And the basic concept is that perceptions, attitudes, behaviors, they all shape both our expectations and then our experiences. And so it's really, really important to know where the gaps are for your campus stakeholders. So in our research in the CMO study, we saw that the most common audience that CMOs had conducted some form of research with, and you can see that here, was current students, with the majority of CMOs also then doing research with faculty and staff, alumni, and interestingly, admitted non-enrolling students. So we're more often doing research with folks that are not coming to campus than folks that we actually are trying to get to come to campus. So, when we evaluated this data by job satisfaction, it was really interesting because there's some significant gaps in research with all audiences beyond current students. You can see here, CMOs who were more satisfied in their role were more likely to report doing research with other audiences. And it makes sense because you're trying to be the voice of the customer, right? It's going to reduce those blind spots. It's going to reduce that level of reputational risk from negative word of mouth. It really matters because the student experience isn't the only experience that matters in shaping your brand. It's the experience that your faculty and staff have with your campus, which in turn then, is how they treat current students. If you're a follower of Simpson Scarborough, you've heard us talk for years now about this idea of the faculty dip. And, that's the reality that in research that we do, faculty are generally more critical of their own institution than other audiences. And that can seem like a funny anecdote. It's fun to say faculty dips. But, how can you effectively recruit graduate or professional students if there's negative faculty sentiment? Those folks are literally on the front lines of talking to those students one-on-one about coming to your institution. So if you have the data to be an authentic voice of the customer, it makes sense you would be more satisfied in your role. When there's a mismatch between the brand promise, between then what internal audiences experience, we call that an experience gap. So we're showing you an example here of what that looks like. It can really shine a light on a brand strength you're not talking about enough, or that you're being inauthentic about in your marketing. And this can play out in a number of ways, but let's focus kind of a little bit on the experience gap that is likely top of mind, which is the gap between internal perceptions and prospective students. So we thought we would show you an example of that and what this looks like from a research standpoint, and then how that plays out, from a strategic standpoint. This is from a small private liberal arts institution earlier this year, where we sort of were able to really show an experience gap. And this gap was that prospects really felt that student outcomes were a top desired attribute in picking a school. But this internal audiences didn't agree, right? This is a really classic one. This is one from some recent research, but we see this a lot. What's more, we knew from kind of researching an audience that is rarely studied, if you'll remember from a few slides back, parents of prospects, that there was an increased expectation when it came to outcomes. So parents wanted strong outcomes even more so than any of the other audiences, which makes sense, right? The gap really emerged here because outcomes weren't being perceived the same way across these audience groups. And if you didn't do the research across all of them, you wouldn't see this gap. So students were thinking about outcomes through the lens of a career. But at this particular institution, nearly 40% of the students at this campus chose a path other than direct employment in the year immediately following graduation. So the challenge for marketing here then was to set clear expectations about what outcomes means, right? And knowing this gap, we were able to kind of lean into some adjusted messaging strategy that was still really authentic to the campus, but more relevant to students and their parents, and did a better job of setting expectations. And you can see, again, here on this slide, that this messaging pillar around academics, for example, we leaned into the language of whatever comes next. And when talking about outcomes, we were really focused on the notion of pursuing passions and living fulfilling lives. So, again, I think the big thing here is it's really, really not enough to identify the experience gaps, but CMOs need to fight to be able to influence those things. And so, when looking at CMO involvement in some real institutional conversations, you can see that CMOs are happier when they have a seat at the table and they're involved in these types of issues. There's significant gaps between satisfied and dissatisfied CMOs when it comes to the ability to be able to be involved in some of those most critical conversations. In particular, you can see that satisfied CMOs here had voices into things like DEIB, employee morale, retention, fundraising strategy, board management, and new program development, right? That is really, really shaping what we think is a truly strategic role. And it's a nice segue to kind of the last of the three themes that we wanted to talk about, which is the notion that the CMO of the future is also going to really be the chief accountability officer. So more than anything else, satisfied CMOs want to be able to make an impact on their campus beyond marketing in the traditional sense. So, the CMO is going to be the person who holds the institution accountable to the brand promise, so that it's not just a slogan or a strategy line, but it's holding us accountable to living and breathing those things in the business decisions that we're making, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about silos and satisfaction. Here is kind of the continuum of most higher education marketing organizations right now. Colleges and universities need to move towards more centralized and integrated organizational structures. That is kind of, going to push us towards really clearly defined and consistent goals and priorities from across the institution. This is especially true at large institutions. We saw in our data that CMOs at large institutions were 3 times more likely to report a decentralized structure than CMOs at smaller institutions. Quite simply, there is not enough budget, talent, or professionalism across the enterprise for marketing communications to not be centralized or center-led if you look at this continuum. If it's not one of these, it's really a function of institutional politics. Even at schools where budgeting is unit-based and deans are responsible for their own revenue lines, they cannot outspend the institutional identity. The school name is still going to be associated with the university, right? So you don't need to push your campus to necessarily be in the far right column, but marketing leaders have really got to understand that a certain level of centralization, of oversight, of real deep coordination is critical to brand management. Here's just a few institutions we've come across in our work that are increasing integration within their organizational structures. And these institutions and their organizational shifts really vary in terms of the level and the way that they are centralizing or becoming more integrated. One that we like to talk about because, this busting silos, aligning silos, and at times feels like it's impossible. But maybe you've followed some of the news from the PASHE system. At Commonwealth University, what they did is they took 3 smaller campuses that were in the eastern side of Pennsylvania and a part of the PASHE system. They've merged into forming one umbrella accredited university. Those institutions still have their own identities. They still confer their own degrees, but part of that merger has been to combine and centralize all of the marketing efforts of those 3 institutions with a single marketing leader reporting to the president and sitting on cabinet. It's a unified time of kind of representing all 3 of those institutions. So that's an example at a really large school. Again, it's not just about marketing professionals that need to be housed in one singular organization. It's about how we manage and lead these large, complex teams across institutions. And, what we think is paramount is that CMOs at minimum work across campuses to understand, what that overall marketing picture looks like. One really, really telling finding from our study is that only 50% of all of the respondents could estimate a total marketing investment for their campus. And if that long found truism of you can't, what is it? You can't measure what you, oh my gosh, now I'm totally blanking on it. You can't measure what you can't count, right? And is the basic idea there. And so if you don't know your budget, how can you measure the ROI? Here we found kind of, how critical being integrated is in relation to job satisfaction. So we're going to show you 2 slides here quickly. Nearly 2/3 of satisfied CMOs have a cross-divisional marketing team or task force that meets regularly. Less than half of the dissatisfied CMOs said the same, right? And you can understand why that gap in job satisfaction exists. If you're not regularly bringing together marketing professionals across campus, there's probably little brand cohesion. There's big discrepancies in the level of expertise, in quality, in outcomes. There's poor professional development. There's probably a lot of turnover. There's a lot of redundancy, and there's a lot of discordant messaging and wasted ad spend. Perhaps even more important, and especially when we're thinking about the CMO as this idea of the chief accountability officer, is the need to build strong relationships that lead to this integrated effort across cabinets and across campus. So similar to the cross-divisional task force, what we see is pretty sizable gap in job satisfaction between those that have made integration across units, including recruitment, student retention, fundraising, and alumni affairs a priority, and success for those who haven't. So for satisfied CMOs, 7 in 10 report integrated efforts. Less than half of these who were dissatisfied reported an integrated effort. And if we get a bit more granular here, you can see how this shakes out within individual relationships between folks on cabinet. So nearly every CMO reports that they have a strong relationship with admissions. We start to see job satisfaction really be different with reported relationships with student affairs and advancement. And so you can see, I want to highlight one of these for a second here, which is a really, really big gap. The relationship between student affairs and the central marketing team. This goes back to this idea of the experience gaps that we talked about before. Let's say that your relationship with admissions is really great and it pays off. All those touch points that prospects have that you're working on together really closely, they compel students to enroll. And then that's when their decision and the cycle starts over again, right? If you don't have that same kind of relationship with student affairs, you run a heightened risk of creating that experience gap that we talked about before. So it's not just about forging this relationship, it's about protecting the institution. It goes back to the issues and crisis things that we talked about before. It's leaning into that opportunity. If you're making the experience better, you're creating that word of mouth, you're creating those influencers on your own campus to ensure that we're living up to that brand. And the last kind of example that brings that to life that we really want to share with you is a little bit of the work that Jenny Petty is leading as the Chief Marketing and Experience Officer at the University of Montana. They've been very, very intentional about building a really strong relationship with the VP of Student Affairs there and the athletics director, it's worth noting. And that's led to a few key improvements. So you're going to notice a few shots of students tubing. And that may seem like, well, that happens in any campus where there's a river, right? But this was an activity that was suggested by the marketing team and implemented into their student orientation each fall. One of the key pillars of the University of Montana's brand is to create a sense of place and connection to the environment. So tubing is about grounding students in this sense of place. It's about this notion of really tying it to the brand platform, ensuring that current students talk with new students on the ride down about conservation efforts for the river, how important that is to their community. And this is one example of many that the team at Montana has been able to do, things like kindness days that are meant to communicate a connectedness pillar of that brand. And the end product is twofold. One, these events kind of go from fun to being events with purpose, right? Really helping students make that connection to the brand identity, to their own sense of selves. And the second point here is probably just as important. It really ties to an institutional priority and outcome, which was improving retention. Back in 2017, retention at Montana was only 68%, which is really low for flagship institution. If you fast forward to this academic year, retention has climbed nearly 10 percentage points. And it's experiences like this that align to the brand promise that really are the types of things that help make a difference. These relationships are not built overnight, but they're so critical and they're so important. And they play such a massive part in CMOs being more satisfied in their job. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Steve.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So just to put a bow on our conversation for today, there's really three core ways that we think the CMO is going to continue to evolve in the coming years. And hopefully you can see now how viewing this evolution through a job satisfaction lens shines a light on why it's worth moving in these directions. But just in case you can't see that connection, I'm going to make one final point here, which is that the role of the CMO is and this is both the purest way to say this and yet a massive understatement at the same time, but hard. And evolving in the manner in which we've talked about today is also not going to happen overnight. And depending on the culture of your campus, also going to be hard. But it is worth the effort because, as you can see, I think job satisfaction is really the beginning of a virtuous cycle, one in which happier CMOs are supplied with the resourcing they need to make a cross-campus impact that they desire, which increases the level at which institutional leadership understands the importance of marketing, which in turn fuels job satisfaction and starts the cycle all over again. Really, this feels like the moment, all of this instability, all of this opportunity, this feels like the moment that CMOs wanted in 2014. And it feels like the moment that still matters to CMOs in 2024. So it really feels like now is the time to move towards the CMO of the future. Now, there's a lot still to talk about as it pertains to this study. The upcoming webinars that we're going to be hosting include an event on the state of higher education websites, which is going to be taking place on April 25th. The website is often our most valuable brand asset. So we're going to be sharing data from the CMO study alongside our perspectives to help guide future strategies in this area. And then rounding out our chapters within this study, on May 16th, we're going to be hosting a webinar on measurement. Jason alluded to that earlier in terms of measuring which you can count, including the ability to measure brand impact, ROI metrics, and data to take to a president or chancellor beyond just enrollment or rankings improvements. Again, you're going to be receiving a link to the webinar here and full reports by email by the end of the day today. I do want to make one last announcement before we jump into the Q&A today, and that is that early bird registration is officially open for Simpson Scarborough's 2024 CMO Lab event, which is going to be taking place June 11th through 13th in Pittsburgh. Our event is the only event of its kind in this industry. It is an event exclusive for and tailored to the higher education CMO. This year's event is going to focus on enhancing leadership and management skills, unlocking strategies for improving brand and marketing performance, also providing intentional, structured networking opportunities with other chief marketing officers, really great social event at the Warhol Museum. We've got some really exciting keynote speakers alongside some fantastic panelists from across the industry and in some cases beyond our industry. So we are really excited to be putting this event on again. Really hope that you can join us. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know we're dropping a link to the landing page for this event and would really love for you to check this out. If you were with us last year, we'd love to see you again. If you couldn't join us last year, well, we'd love to introduce you to what I think is the best event of the year. So with that, I want to open up the floor to some questions that may have come in while we've been going through chapter 2 on job satisfaction for the CMO study. I'm going to pull this screen down so that we can actually just see each other's faces here. There we go. We've got about 10 minutes for questions here. If you have something you want answered live, I would definitely go ahead and ask your question using the Q&A feature. I was not able, in full transparency, to keep up with the chat function, which was flying fast and furious throughout this event. So if you did drop a question in there, I did not see it. One question that I want to ask to you, Jason, because I know it actually came up earlier this week and I saw it again, was around the idea of, and I think you mentioned it when you mentioned the Boise State example and the UW-Madison example. This is a politically tense industry right now in terms of the campuses that are operating in certain states. Do you get a sense here if there's anything around CMOs who are operating in maybe politically conservative states or more progressive states, red and blue as we like to call it, if that had an impact on job satisfaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had this question internally earlier this week when we were kind of going over things, and And even thinking about a couple of the examples that we talked about, whether it was Wisconsin, or we're talking about Boise, and those kinds of states. And we looked a little bit further into the data, and we actually didn't see a whole lot of difference between satisfaction between red state CMOs and red states or blue states. And I know that it's going to be a really, really challenging year because we're in an active political cycle right now. And there's going to be, higher education, DEI efforts are squarely in the most political rhetoric. And so it's a challenging time to be able to communicate value and tell those stories. But it's a really, really important and imperative time to be able to do that too, because I think the negative rhetoric, the negative sentiment is going to be out there in the world, and institutions are going to continue to be under fire in the next several months.
Great question. Thank you, Jason, for that answer. I want to follow up with another question, which, Jason, I'm actually going to pass to you again, if that's all right. Question about, we talked a lot, and I think your first point really emphasized this, Jason, around the blending of the chief marketing officer role and the chief communications officer role. A great question asked anonymously about, what about when marketing is combined with other areas? I know we're seeing quite often it's marketing and enrollment management. We've also seen in some cases marketing and advancement, and how that can fuel kind of how a CMO operates and leans into some of these communications, but also experience and accountability themes.
Yeah. So, I mean, it goes back to one of the things that we talked about before, which is, as much as we want to try to push to a level of centralization or center-led, at Simpson Scarborough, and I think many people that are on the webinar today would kind of agree that that's the ideal scenario. The reality is, our enterprises are still big enough that there is going to be marketing and communications responsibility that continues to happen throughout the organization. And so here's where, some of those key findings that we found, are really, really important, which is, do you know the activity that's actually happening in those units? Are you bringing those people together? Are you measuring and holding those units that are doing marketing on their own to some level of accountability? Is that information being reported and shared with your CFO, with your president, with your chancellor, with your board in some kind of holistic way? Right. And so there are certainly KPIs that can be developed that, really, really help in understanding, is this marketing investment adding up for the institution? Is it making a difference? How is it laddering up then and even helping us in some broader goals, whether those are reputational goals or enrollment goals or whatever? All too often we see, especially with enrollment, where we're seeing pretty major investments in things like digital marketing, advertising, search, even events. And those dollars they're not being evaluated. What we're really just looking is, what's the bottom line? Are we getting the number of students that we want? But how do we drive down cost of acquisition? How do we know that the dollars that we're spending, if we were spending zero, would we still be just as effective? And I think there are some institutions, especially the large flagships, that know that they probably could spend no dollars on enrollment marketing and on advertising in particular from a paid media standpoint, and still enroll the same number of students. So why are we spending those dollars? Why are we not at least measuring and being effective here? And this goes back to this notion of the CMO or the CMO plus CCO. Part of your job is accountability, right? And bringing that level of accountability back to the cabinet so that we're having those tough conversations. That's not to say that there hasn't been innovation here. There are lots of schools that are doing just that, right? There are lots of schools that are doing things that are moving even further along. So, I love to talk about an example. We've had the opportunity to work with Dan Dillon, who's the senior vice president at Arizona State University. And I think everybody that's on here would say that that's a school that has major marketing communications investment, but we know the return on that, and they've done some really innovative things, even on the advancement side, where any gift that's under $500 is really considered marketing activity. The dollars to get to a $500 gift are measured against marketing. They're not measured against advancement. So, we have to be really innovative in the way that we're thinking about this. And it really comes back to that marketing communications leader to be able to think about how they're pulling together some of those strategic conversations. All of these things are super complex, Steve. I mean, even just taking it back to the beginning of the conversation, like, how can you do that if you literally are spending all your time putting out issues and fires every day, right? You can't. So you have to supplement some of your own strength and expertise with folks that can help you do that in some way, or you will never get to the strategic.
Love that response, Jason. I'm going to ask one more question here with the few minutes that we have left. It's a great question from Maria. And I think, Jason, you talked about this earlier when you talked about the integration and some of the cabinet level relationships that we see and the differences in job satisfaction here at the advancement relationship in particular. So great question from Maria. What interesting or promising collaborations do you see from campuses managing university brand and comprehensive or fundraising brand campaigns? And I see your sweatshirt, so I might know what you're going to talk about, but I'll defer to you on some interesting collaborations that you've seen.
Well, I think, the first thing to acknowledge here is that this is a place where I actually think there have been really promising collaborations for a long time. And it goes back to many of the very early marketing investments that were made at any campus came from one-time investments when there were capital campaigns that were being launched. That's how branding started at colleges and universities. And I know Terry's is in the chat on the webinar with us today. That's the ideal when we think about a truly integrated advancement model, right? Where we think about advancement as advancing the institution, not just advancing philanthropy. So there's history there. The challenge is, again, when we start to fall into these silos and it becomes just about raising money or just about communicating with alumni or just about, ego in launching something new because we're tired of something that may have already existed. So to get to the example that you talked about, that you pointed to, Steve, on my sweatshirt, proud NC State alum, congratulations to anyone from NC State that's on this webinar. They raised $45 million on their day of giving yesterday. So if you want to talk about integrated marketing, communications, branding, and advancement, that's an example right there. There was a lot of effort from a communication side to really kind of go there. And it stems back to a decision they made more than a decade ago, right? They invested in building a strong brand strategy around this notion of think and do. And then quite simply, when they did the capital campaign work, they didn't rename the slogan for the institution. They didn't come up with a new brand strategy. Instead, they called the campaign Think and Do the Extraordinary. And they built out meaning and depth to what that story looks like. And now here they are, and it's still sticking, right? And it's resonant with donors. It's resonant, with their current campus. It's resonant with prospective students because they've stuck to a strategy over a period of time and really done that work. So there are lots and lots of good examples, but that's one that has been in place for a while now.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that response, Maria, and to everyone else who asked a question today. I appreciate all of you. To everyone who contributed, shared their own experiences, asked great questions, reacted to some of today's content. Just an incredible conversation, the kind of conversation that you could have in person in Pittsburgh in June, I might just say, at the CMO Lab. I know we're 1 minute past the hour, so I don't want to hold up everybody else. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I hope we get to see you again next month for Chapter 3 on the State of Higher Ed websites. Until then, keep on keeping on. Thanks, everybody. Take care.